The city streets were drenched from the heavy rain that had been falling all night. The rhythmic patter of raindrops against the pavement created a soothing yet melancholic backdrop as Officer Mike Reynolds made his way through the nearly deserted parking lot. His flashlight cut through the darkness, its beam dancing off the slick asphalt and reflecting the neon lights of the nearby skyscrapers. The glow from the high-rise buildings above seemed distant, almost indifferent to the solitude below. Mike's routine patrol had been uneventful until now. His boots splashed through puddles, and he occasionally paused to peer into the shadows, searching for any signs of trouble. The empty parking lot stretched out before him, a labyrinth of parked cars and distant echoes. It was in this bleak, rain-soaked landscape that he first heard it, a faint, pitiful cry. Stopping in his tracks, Mike focused his attention on the source of the sound. His breath formed misty clouds in the chill of the night air as he squinted through the rain. The cry grew louder, a soft but persistent whimper that tugged at his conscience. Without hesitation, he followed the sound, weaving through rows of parked cars, the rain soaking through his uniform. The noise led him to a small, forlorn figure huddled against the cold metal of a car. A young girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, sat curled up, her face streaked with tears and rain. Her tiny body trembled, not just from the cold but from a deep sense of fear. Mike's heart ached as he knelt down, trying to offer a reassuring smile despite the weight of the situation. "Hey there, are you okay?" Mike's voice was gentle, attempting to cut through the girl's distress. She looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, her small frame trembling even more as she took in the sight of the uniformed officer. She didn't answer, just continued to stare at him as if unsure whether to trust him. Mike's eyes softened with empathy. He removed his rain-soaked jacket and carefully wrapped it around her, trying to provide some warmth and comfort. "Let's get you out of the rain, okay?" he said softly. As he helped her to her feet, he glanced around, hoping to spot any sign of her parents. There was none. The parking lot remained eerily quiet, the only sound the gentle patter of the rain. Carefully, he led her to his patrol car, where the interior light provided a small haven from the dreary night. He settled her into the passenger seat and grabbed a blanket from the back. As he wrapped the blanket around her, he couldn't help but wonder how such a small child had ended up alone in this desolate place. "Do you know where your mommy or daddy is?" he asked gently. The girl shook her head, her small hands clutching the edges of the blanket tightly. Mike could see that she was shivering, both from the cold and from the fear of being alone. He turned to his radio, calling in the situation and requesting backup. As he waited for the response, he glanced at the girl, who had now managed to settle a bit, her sobs reducing to quiet sniffles. He knew he had to find out where she belonged and get her to safety as quickly as possible. Within minutes, the radio crackled to life, and the dispatcher relayed that a missing child report had come in. Mike's heart sank as he heard the description matched the girl sitting beside him. She was indeed the missing child of a prominent family. The reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just another routine call. This was a connection to a world far beyond his usual patrol. As he waited for the family's representatives to arrive, Mike's mind raced. He couldn't ignore the weight of the responsibility now on his shoulders. The night, once a backdrop to his routine duties, had transformed into a gateway to a world of complexities he was unprepared for. The sound of approaching sirens signaled the arrival of the family's representatives. The girl's worried parents, along with a small entourage of security personnel, arrived on the scene, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and anxiety. As they rushed to the car, the sight of their child safely seated inside brought visible tears to their eyes. Mike watched as the parents embraced their daughter, their gratitude evident but tinged with the stress of the situation. He introduced himself and provided a brief account of the events leading up to this moment. His role was far from over, but the immediate danger had been mitigated. As he drove back to his patrol route, the events of the night replayed in his mind. What had begun as a mundane shift had evolved into something far more significant. Mike was left contemplating the ripple effects of his unexpected encounter. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would forever alter the course of his life. The following morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the previous night's storm. The sun's rays pierced through the city skyline, casting long shadows and bathing the streets in a golden glow. Officer Mike Reynolds, still processing the gravity of last night's events, arrived at the precinct to a flurry of activity. News of the missing child's return had spread quickly, and the usual bustle was amplified by the media frenzy. Mike settled into his routine, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the little girl and the surprising revelation of her connection to an influential family. Just as he began to lose himself in the paperwork, a call came through from the precinct's senior officer. Mike was requested to meet with representatives from the family who had arrived at the station. As Mike walked into the conference room, he was met with a striking contrast to the grim environment of the night before. The room was filled with high-profile figures, their tailored suits and polished shoes reflecting the city's elite. At the center of this group was a man and a woman, their faces a blend of relief and apprehension. They were elegantly dressed, their demeanor polished and controlled, yet their eyes betrayed a lingering worry. "Officer Reynolds," the man said, extending a firm handshake. "I'm Richard Ellington, and this is my wife, Emily. We can't thank you enough for bringing our daughter back to us." Emily's voice was gentle but strained, her eyes holding a depth of gratitude mingled with exhaustion. Mike offered a modest smile, acknowledging their thanks. "I'm just glad she's safe. I'm here to help in any way I can." As the family settled into their seats, Richard began to explain the circumstances leading up to the incident. Their daughter, Lily, had been missing for several hours before Mike found her. The Ellingtons had been frantic, reaching out to every possible contact to locate their child. The display of wealth and privilege in the room was palpable, but it did little to mask the anxiety they felt. "Officer Reynolds," Richard continued, his tone shifting to one of seriousness, "we appreciate everything you've done, but there are a few details we need to discuss. This situation has brought to light some concerns that we need to address immediately." Mike's curiosity was piqued. "Of course. What concerns are you referring to?" Emily spoke up, her voice tinged with both concern and urgency. "We're deeply grateful, but this incident has caused a significant disruption in our lives. Our security protocols were compromised, and we need to understand how this happened and what measures we should take moving forward." Mike nodded, understanding the gravity of their concerns. "I'll assist in any way possible. What can I do to help address these issues?" Richard's expression softened slightly as he appreciated Mike's willingness to cooperate. "We've arranged for a security team to review the situation and ensure it doesn't happen again. However, there are also protocols for handling situations involving our family that we must discuss." As the conversation progressed, Mike realized that the Ellingtons were not only concerned about their daughter's safety but also about how the incident might affect their public image and social standing. The discussion veered into the realm of high society's expectations and the intricate balance of privacy and security. Richard leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Mike. "We're aware that this situation has placed you in the spotlight. We want to ensure that you're not burdened by any undue attention or complications that might arise from this incident." Emily added, "We would like to offer our support and express our gratitude. If there's anything you need or any way we can assist you, please let us know." Mike felt a mixture of humility and unease. The family's offer of support was genuine, but it also introduced a new layer of complexity to his role. He was no longer just a police officer performing his duties. He was now entangled in a world of high expectations and potential repercussions. "Thank you," Mike said, his voice steady. "I appreciate your support. My priority is ensuring that Lily remains safe, and that we understand how to prevent such incidents in the future." The meeting concluded with the Ellingtons expressing their thanks once more before leaving the room. Mike watched them depart, their poised demeanor a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil they had experienced. As he returned to his desk, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning of a much larger and more intricate story. The sun continued to shine brightly outside, illuminating the city with a sense of normalcy that seemed almost ironic given the whirlwind of events that had unfolded. Mike was left contemplating the complexities of his new role and the expectations that now surrounded him. The night had brought him face to face with an unexpected reality, and as he prepared for the days ahead, he knew that the journey would demand much more than just his professional skills. The days following the incident were a blur of media attention and heightened security measures. The once ordinary streets of the city were now a stage for paparazzi and news crews, all eager to capture any glimpse of the Ellingtons. Officer Mike Reynolds found himself at the center of this whirlwind, navigating a new reality where his every move seemed to be scrutinized. Mike's patrols were no longer confined to the quiet streets and dimly lit parking lots. His duties now included frequent check-ins at the Ellington Mansion, a sprawling estate that seemed to embody both luxury and isolation. The mansion, with its high walls and meticulous gardens, felt like a fortress, a world apart from the bustling city it overlooked. The transition from his standard police work to this elevated role was jarring. Mike had always been comfortable in his role as a city officer, but the Ellingtons' world was an entirely different beast. The mansion's opulence was a constant reminder of the disparity between his previous life and the new responsibilities thrust upon him. One afternoon, Mike arrived at the mansion for a routine security check. The atmosphere inside was tense, filled with an undercurrent of unease. The Ellingtons' personal security team, a group of highly trained professionals, moved with a practiced efficiency, their eyes constantly scanning for any signs of trouble. Mike was greeted by Richard Ellington, who was pacing the grand foyer, his face etched with concern. Emily was nearby, speaking quietly on the phone with someone Mike assumed was a crisis management consultant. The air was thick with unspoken worries, a stark contrast to the polished surfaces and opulent decor. "Officer Reynolds," Richard said, his tone clipped, "we need to discuss some recent developments. There have been a few security breaches that we need to address immediately." Mike followed Richard into a private study, where he was briefed on the recent incidents. The breaches were minor but unsettling. Unauthorized individuals had managed to slip past security, and there had been several suspicious packages left at the gates. Each incident seemed to heighten the tension within the household. "We need to ensure that these breaches don't happen again," Richard said firmly. "Our security team is already on high alert, but I want to know what more we can do. What do you suggest?" Mike took a deep breath, assessing the situation. "First, we should review the security protocols and ensure they are strictly enforced. We need to identify any potential weaknesses and address them immediately. Also, increasing patrols around the perimeter might help deter further incidents." Richard nodded, his expression a mix of relief and apprehension. "I trust your judgment. We're also considering bringing in additional security experts to evaluate our current measures." As Mike prepared to leave the study, he caught sight of Emily, who was now speaking with a team of security consultants. Her face was pale, her hands clutching a stack of documents. It was clear that the weight of the situation was taking a toll on her, just as it was on Richard. Outside, Mike continued his patrol, his thoughts consumed by the complexities of the new environment. The mansion's high walls seemed to close in on him, a reminder of the barriers between him and the life he used to lead. He felt the weight of expectation, not only from the Ellingtons but also from the public who were following the story closely. As he walked the perimeter, he encountered members of the security team, their expressions stern and focused. Mike tried to strike up a conversation, but the team members were reserved, their interactions formal. It was evident that they were operating within a tightly controlled system, one that Mike was still trying to understand. The night brought no respite. A series of late-night phone calls and urgent meetings kept Mike on edge. He found himself in a constant state of alert, grappling with the pressure of ensuring the Ellington's safety while trying to maintain his own balance. Back at his apartment, Mike stared out of the window, the city lights twinkling below. The once familiar sights now seemed distant, a world away from the intense scrutiny and high stakes of his new role. He reflected on the challenges he faced, balancing his duties, dealing with the Ellingtons' expectations, and navigating the complex dynamics of their world. As he prepared for another day of high-stress interactions and heightened security, Mike understood that he was no longer just a city officer. He was part of a larger, more intricate narrative, one that demanded not only his professional skills, but also his ability to adapt and thrive in an environment far removed from his usual experiences. The night was quiet, but Mike knew that the challenges ahead were anything but. The complexities of his new role were just beginning to unfold, and he was on the cusp of discovering how deep the rabbit hole went. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the city. The Ellington mansion, with its towering gates and elaborate stonework, seemed to pulse with an almost palpable tension as the day turned to night. Officer Mike Reynolds was once again patrolling the estate, but tonight, the sense of unease was more pronounced than ever. The security team had intensified their efforts. Patrols were more frequent, and the mansion's perimeter was now lined with additional surveillance cameras. The once ordinary mansion was now a fortress, bristling with technology and guarded by an array of security personnel. Despite the enhanced measures, an undercurrent of anxiety lingered, making every creak and rustle in the shadows seem like a potential threat. Mike's radio crackled with a burst of static before dispatch relayed a new development. A series of threatening letters had been discovered. The letters, sent anonymously, contained disturbing messages that hinted at more than just idle threats. The writer seemed to know intimate details about the Ellingtons' lives, fueling the growing concern. As Mike read through the letters in the command center, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The threats were specific and unsettling, detailing the movements of the Ellington family and hinting at plans to breach their security. Mike glanced at the Ellingtons, who were gathered in a corner of the room, their faces a mixture of determination and fear. The gravity of the situation was unmistakable. Richard Ellington approached Mike, his expression hardened by worry. "We need to address this immediately. The threats are escalating, and our security team is stretched thin. What can we do to prevent these threats from turning into something more serious?" Mike took a deep breath, weighing his words carefully. "We need to increase our vigilance and look into the background of anyone who might have a motive. It might also be worth considering whether there's someone on the inside who could be leaking information." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You think there's a possibility of an inside leak?" "It's possible," Mike said. "In situations like this, we can't afford to overlook any potential sources of information. I recommend a thorough review of all personnel and security measures." Emily, who had been silently listening, nodded in agreement. "We'll cooperate fully. We can't let this person continue to threaten our safety." The room was filled with the hum of activity as security personnel scrambled to implement Mike's recommendations. The mansion was now on high alert, and Mike could feel the pressure mounting with each passing minute. Every shadow seemed to harbor potential danger, every sound a possible signal of an impending breach. As Mike conducted his own sweep of the estate, he found himself reflecting on the weight of his responsibilities. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was intensifying. The once familiar patrols now seemed fraught with peril, every corner of the mansion an arena for potential threats. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. Mike's patrols took him through the grand halls and opulent rooms of the mansion, each space meticulously maintained but now cloaked in an aura of anxiety. The grandeur of the estate felt starkly out of place amid the mounting tension. During a brief lull in his patrol, Mike sat in a quiet corner of the mansion, his thoughts swirling with the enormity of the task at hand. The serene beauty of the estate was overshadowed by the sense of impending danger. The letters, the heightened security, and the Ellingtons' palpable fear all combined to create a pressure cooker of anxiety. Just as Mike was about to resume his patrol, his radio buzzed with urgent news. A security breach had been detected near the eastern perimeter of the estate. Mike's heart raced as he sprinted toward the location, his mind racing through the possibilities. As he reached the perimeter, he was greeted by the security team, who were already in the midst of securing the area. The breach had been minor, a cut in the perimeter fence, but the implications were serious. It was clear that the threats were not just idle talk. Someone was actively trying to breach the mansion's defenses. Mike and the security team worked swiftly to repair the fence and reinforce the perimeter. The night air was crisp and filled with the sounds of activity as they secured the area. The breach, while contained, had underscored the severity of the threat and the need for constant vigilance. When the immediate threat was addressed, Mike stood at the edge of the estate, the cold wind biting at his face. The mansion, now a fortress under constant siege, loomed in the distance, its grandeur diminished by the shadow of fear. As dawn approached, Mike knew that the pressures of the night were far from over. The threats were real and the challenges were escalating. The tranquil facade of the mansion belied the turmoil within, and Mike was acutely aware of the weight of his role in this high-stakes scenario. The night's events had only heightened the urgency of the situation, setting the stage for even greater challenges ahead. Mike's resolve was tested, and the true extent of the conflict began to take shape, revealing a landscape fraught with danger and uncertainty. The early morning light seeped through the heavy curtains of the Ellington mansion, casting a pale glow over the ornate furnishings. Officer Mike Reynolds, bleary-eyed from another restless night, was already on duty, patrolling the estate with renewed vigilance. The security breaches and escalating threats had heightened his awareness, but today promised a different kind of tension. As Mike made his rounds, he noticed an unusual flurry of activity near the mansion's library. Security personnel and staff members were gathered around, speaking in hushed tones. Intrigued and concerned, Mike approached the scene, where Richard Ellington stood with a look of grim determination. "We need to talk," Richard said, beckoning Mike to follow him into the library. The room was lined with towering bookshelves and decorated with antique furniture, yet the air was charged with an unmistakable tension. Richard shut the door behind them and turned to Mike, his face taut with worry. "We've discovered something alarming." One of the threatening letters contained a clue, a reference to something hidden in this very house. Mike's interest peaked. "What do you mean by something hidden?" Richard gestured to a desk in the corner of the room. Emily found an old ledger in a hidden compartment of this desk. The ledger details some of our family's financial transactions and other activities. It's possible that someone has been using this information to manipulate the current situation. Mike examined the ledger, its pages filled with meticulous entries. As he flipped through the worn, yellowed pages, a series of irregularities caught his eye. Unusual transactions, obscure references, and names that were unfamiliar. It was clear that this ledger held secrets, but understanding its full significance would require more time. "We need to investigate these entries thoroughly," Mike said. "The clues might help us understand who's behind the threats and why they're targeting your family." Richard nodded. "I agree, but be cautious. If someone knew about this ledger, they might also be aware of our investigation." Emily, who had been observing silently, stepped forward. "I have a sense that these secrets go deeper than just financial dealings. There's something personal here, something that could explain why we're being targeted." As Mike continued to study the ledger, he noticed a name repeated several times: Julian Hart. The name appeared in connection with some of the irregular transactions and was linked to a series of investments and financial arrangements that seemed out of place. Intrigued, Mike made a note to investigate further. The investigation into Julian Hart led Mike to an old address in a less affluent part of the city. As he drove through the winding streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the brink of uncovering something crucial. The neighborhood was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Ellington estate, a reminder of the disparate worlds at play in this unfolding drama. Arriving at the address, Mike was met by a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Tom Hart, Julian's estranged brother. Tom's small, cluttered house was a far cry from the luxury of the Ellington mansion, and his demeanor was one of wary resignation. Tom's eyes were wary but softened as Mike introduced himself. "Julian, he's been involved in some shady business for years. He's always had a chip on his shoulder about the Ellingtons. He believes they wronged him somehow, but I don't know the full story." Mike listened intently as Tom recounted Julian's grievances. Apparently, Julian had been involved in a failed business venture that had left him deeply in debt. Tom hinted that Julian had blamed the Ellingtons for his financial ruin, though he wasn't entirely sure how. "Julian's been obsessed with the idea of revenge," Tom continued. "He thought he could leverage any information he could find to get back at them. As Mike left Tom's house, he felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. Julian Hart's grudge against the Ellingtons appeared to be more than just a personal vendetta. It was a vendetta driven by financial desperation and a desire for retribution. Returning to the mansion, Mike shared his findings with Richard and Emily. The revelation that Julian Hart was the mastermind behind the threats and breaches added a new layer of urgency to their situation. Richard's face tightened with anger and concern, while Emily looked visibly shaken by the personal nature of the threats. "We need to act quickly," Richard said, his voice resolute. "If Julian is behind this, we need to find him before he can escalate things further." Mike nodded in agreement. "I'll work with the local authorities to track him down. In the meantime, we should bolster our security and remain vigilant." The tension in the mansion had reached new heights. The once secure environment now felt fraught with danger, and Mike's role had become more critical than ever. The secrets revealed had not only illuminated the motive behind the threats, but also set the stage for an escalating confrontation. As night fell, Mike took one last patrol around the mansion, the weight of the new revelations pressing heavily on him. The secrets of the ledger and the threat of Julian Hart loomed large, and Mike knew that the coming days would be crucial in unraveling the complex web of deception and ensuring the safety of the Ellingtons. The dawn brought a hazy light to the Ellington mansion, but the air inside was thick with tension. Officer Mike Reynolds had spent another sleepless night, his mind racing with the latest revelations about Julian Hart. As he sipped his coffee, the bitter taste mirrored the conflict brewing within him. The situation had become deeply personal, and the stakes had never been higher. Richard and Emily Ellington joined him in the kitchen, their faces drawn with worry. Richard broke the silence, his voice heavy with determination. "We need to decide our next steps. We can't let Julian continue to threaten our family." Mike nodded, setting down his cup. "I've been coordinating with the local authorities. They're increasing surveillance and manpower to help track Julian down. But we need to be prepared for anything." Emily's eyes were shadowed with fear and resolve. "What if he tries to breach our security again? We need a plan to keep everyone safe." The gravity of the situation hung in the air as they discussed their options. Richard's jaw tightened. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to protect my family, but we have to consider every angle. We can't act rashly." Mike listened carefully, weighing their words. He knew they were right. The decisions they made now would have far-reaching consequences. The responsibility of ensuring the safety of the Ellington family rested heavily on his shoulders, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. As they debated their strategy, a sudden knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Mike's hand instinctively went to his holster, but it was just a deliverman with a package. Richard signed for it, his movements tense and wary. The package, however, contained an unexpected twist. Inside was a letter from Julian Hart himself. The note was terse and filled with venom, taunting the Ellingtons and daring them to catch him. He claimed to have more leverage than they realized, and his words dripped with the promise of further chaos. Emily's face blanched as she read the letter. "He's playing games with us. We can't let him control the narrative." Mike's mind raced as he considered their options. This could be a trap. He might be trying to draw us out, make us act impulsively. We need to stay one step ahead. Richard's eyes narrowed. "We need more information. If Julian has leverage, we need to find out what it is and neutralize it." The day passed in a blur of activity. Mike coordinated with the police, reviewed security footage, and pored over the ledger with Richard. Every entry, every transaction, every detail was scrutinized for clues. The tension was palpable, and the pressure was mounting. As night fell, Mike found himself alone in the mansion's grand study, the weight of their dilemma pressing down on him. The room's opulent decor was a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. He knew that every decision he made could either protect or endanger the Ellington family. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. Emily entered, her face etched with concern. "Mike, can we talk?" He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. She took a seat opposite him, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "I'm scared, Mike. Scared for my family. Scared of what Julian might do. But I trust you. You've been a rock through all of this." Mike felt a surge of determination. "I won't let anything happen to you or your family, Emily. We'll get through this together." Emily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mike. Your support means everything to us." As she left, Mike turned back to his thoughts, his resolve hardening. He knew what he had to do. He would delve deeper into the investigation, follow every lead, and make the tough decisions necessary to protect the Ellingtons. The night stretched on, and the weight of the dilemmas they faced seemed to grow heavier. Mike reviewed the security protocols, ensuring that every measure was in place. He knew that Julian was cunning and resourceful, but he was determined to stay ahead. In the quiet moments, as the mansion settled into an uneasy silence, Mike reflected on his role in this drama. He had been thrust into a world of privilege and danger, and he was determined to navigate it with skill and courage. The morning light found Mike still at his post, his mind sharper than ever. The decisions they faced were daunting, but he was ready to confront them head-on. The Ellingtons depended on him, and he would not let them down. As the new day dawned, the mansion buzzed with a renewed sense of purpose. The dilemmas and decisions of the previous day had set the stage for the battles to come. Mike knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he was ready to face them, one step at a time. The grandeur of the Ellington mansion was cold and unwelcoming that morning. Outside, the skies were overcast, casting a muted light over the estate. Inside, the atmosphere was equally heavy, laden with the weight of recent events and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Officer Mike Reynolds paced the length of the marble hallway, his mind consumed by the latest twists in the unfolding drama. The discoveries from the ledger and Julian Hart's threats had cast a shadow over the mansion, prompting a flurry of activity as Richard Ellington sought allies who could offer support and protection. It was in this climate of mistrust and desperation that the true nature of alliances and betrayals began to emerge. Richard had arranged a crucial meeting with a trusted confidant, Michael Forsyth, an influential figure with connections in both the business and political spheres. Michael's reputation for being shrewd and resourceful was well known, and Richard hoped that his support would help turn the tide. In the opulent drawing room, Michael Forsyth arrived with an air of confidence. His tailored suit and polished demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension that had settled over the Ellingtons. As he greeted Richard, Mike observed the interaction with a scrutinizing eye. "Richard," Michael said, shaking hands with a firm grip, "it's been too long. I hear you're in quite a predicament." Richard nodded, his face a mask of concern. "Indeed, Michael. We're facing a serious threat, and I need your help to navigate this situation." Michael took a seat, his gaze sharp as he assessed the gravity of the situation. "I've heard rumors about Julian Hart and his threats. It's clear that this is more than just a personal vendetta. But we need to understand his motives fully." Mike stepped forward, presenting the findings from their investigation. The evidence from the ledger and Julian's taunts had painted a clear picture of a man driven by bitterness and a desire for revenge. Michael listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "This is a dangerous game," Michael said finally. "Julian is playing his cards close to his chest. If we're to outmaneuver him, we need to be prepared for anything." Richard leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "I need your help to tighten security and to use your connections to gather intelligence on Julian's whereabouts and activities." Michael's lips curled into a contemplative smile. "I can help with that, but remember, alliances are fragile. We must tread carefully." As Michael departed, Mike and Richard were left to ponder his words. There was a sense of unease that lingered, as if the fleeting sense of relief brought by Michael's assurances was overshadowed by the fear of hidden agendas. Later that day, Emily approached Mike with a worried expression. "I overheard something that you need to know," she said. "One of our staff members, Sarah, has been acting strangely. She's been spending a lot of time on her phone and seems unusually nervous." Mike's instincts kicked into high gear. "I'll look into it. It's possible that Julian has someone on the inside." As Mike began to investigate, he discovered that Sarah had been in frequent contact with a number of unknown numbers. Her behavior suggested that she might be involved in something more sinister. Mike decided to confront her, but with caution. That evening, Sarah was called into the mansion's office. She looked nervous, her hands wringing together as she faced Mike. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Mike's gaze was unwavering. "We've been monitoring your activities. If you're involved in something that could endanger the Ellingtons, now is the time to come clean." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Julian threatened me. He said he would harm my family if I didn't help him." The revelation was a gut punch. Sarah's betrayal was not born of malice but of fear. Julian's tactics were more ruthless than anticipated, exploiting vulnerabilities to further his agenda. Mike reassured Sarah, "We'll protect you and your family, but you need to help us. We need to know everything you can about Julian's plans and his network." Sarah nodded, her resolve strengthened by the chance to make amends. She revealed crucial details about Julian's plans and the locations he frequented. The information provided a clearer picture of his intentions and the scope of his operations. With this new intelligence, Mike and Richard began to form a more comprehensive strategy to counter Julian's moves. The stakes were high, and every decision carried weight. The lines between allies and adversaries had blurred, and the need for vigilance was paramount. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the mansion, Mike reviewed their plans and the newly acquired intelligence. The revelations of the day had shifted the balance, and the threats were now more tangible than ever. Emily joined Mike in the office, her expression one of quiet determination. "We need to stay united and focused. We can't let Julian's games tear us apart." Mike nodded, his resolve hardened. "We'll face this head-on. We have the information we need, and we'll use it to protect the people we care about." The night was fraught with anticipation as Mike and Richard prepared for the next phase of their strategy. The betrayals and alliances of the day had set the stage for a confrontation that would test their resolve and their ability to navigate a web of deception. As the mansion settled into a tense silence, the battle lines were drawn. Julian Hart's game was far from over, and Mike knew that the coming days would be critical in determining the outcome of this high-stakes struggle. The mansion was eerily quiet in the early morning light. Shadows cast by the rising sun danced across the walls, and a sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air. Officer Mike Reynolds stood in the study, poring over the latest intelligence reports and piecing together the puzzle that was Julian Hart's master plan. The revelations from Sarah had provided valuable insights, but they also painted a picture of a man who was always one step ahead. Julian's network was vast, and his influence seemed to seep into every corner of their lives. Mike knew that the time for action was drawing near. They needed to strike before Julian could make his next move. Richard Ellington joined Mike in the study, his expression grave. "We need to confront Julian directly," Richard said. "We can't let him continue to dictate the terms." Mike nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Agreed, but we need to be smart about it. We need to catch him off guard." As they strategized, Emily entered the room, her face pale with worry. "Mike, there's something you need to see," she said, handing him her phone. A video message from Julian Hart played on the screen, his sinister smile sending chills down their spines. "Richard, Mike, Emily," Julian's voice dripped with malice. "I hope you've enjoyed the little game we've been playing, but I'm afraid it's time for the final act. I have something you might want back." The camera panned to reveal young Tommy, bound and gagged, his eyes wide with fear. Julian's laughter echoed through the room as he continued. "Meet me at the abandoned warehouse by the docks tonight. Come alone or the boy pays the price." The room fell into a stunned silence. The stakes had never been higher, and the clock was ticking. Mike felt a surge of anger and helplessness. Tommy's safety was paramount, but walking into Julian's trap could spell disaster for them all. "We have no choice," Richard said, his voice trembling. "We have to save Tommy." Mike's mind raced. They needed a plan that would ensure Tommy's safety and bring Julian to justice. "We'll go," he said finally, "but we're not going unprepared. Emily, I need you to contact Michael Forsyth. We'll need backup." Hours later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mike, Richard, and Emily made their way to the docks. The abandoned warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and rusted exterior a stark contrast to the glittering city skyline behind them. They parked a safe distance away and approached cautiously, aware that every step could be their last. Inside the warehouse, shadows danced in the dim light. Julian stood in the center of the room, his smile widening as he saw them approach. Tommy was tied to a chair nearby, his eyes filled with a mix of hope and terror. "You came," Julian said, his voice echoing through the empty space. "How touching. But you should know by now that I always have the upper hand." Mike stepped forward, his eyes locked on Julian. "Let Tommy go, Julian. This is between us." Julian's laughter was cold and cruel. "Always the hero, Mike, but you're out of your league. You see, I've always been one step ahead." As Julian spoke, a group of armed men emerged from the shadows, their guns trained on Mike, Richard, and Emily. The odds were stacked against them, but Mike remained focused. He knew that Michael Forsyth and his team were positioned outside, waiting for the signal. "Now," Julian said, his voice dripping with menace. "Let's end this." With a swift motion, Mike reached into his jacket and pressed a hidden button, signaling Michael and his team to move in. Chaos erupted as the doors burst open and Michael's men stormed the warehouse. Gunfire echoed through the room as the two sides clashed. In the midst of the chaos, Mike lunged at Julian, their struggle intense and brutal. Julian fought back with a ferocity born of desperation, but Mike's determination was unyielding. With a final, decisive blow, Mike managed to subdue Julian, pinning him to the ground. As the dust settled, Michael's team secured the warehouse, disarming Julian's men and freeing Tommy. The young boy ran into his father's arms, tears of relief streaming down his face. Richard held him close, his own eyes brimming with gratitude and sorrow. Julian, bloodied and defeated, was dragged to his feet by Michael. "It's over, Julian," Michael said. "You've lost." Julian's laughter was weak but defiant. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll never be rid of me." Mike watched as Julian was led away, his mind racing with the events of the night. The breaking point had been reached, but the battle was far from over. As they left the warehouse, the weight of the night's events hung heavily over them. In the car, Tommy clung to Richard, his small body trembling. Emily reached over, squeezing Mike's hand. "We did it," she said softly. "We saved him." Mike nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Yes, we did. But Julian's right. This isn't over. We need to stay vigilant." As they drove away from the docks, the city lights flickering in the distance, the bond between them had been tested and strengthened. The breaking point had come and gone, but their resolve remained unbroken. They would face whatever came next together. The drive back from the warehouse was a blur of flashing lights and swirling emotions. Mike's thoughts were consumed by the events of the night and the weight of what lay ahead. They had won a battle, but the war with Julian Hart was far from over. When they reached Richard's home, the atmosphere was somber. They were greeted by a team of police officers and medical staff, ready to tend to their injuries and take Julian into custody. Julian's words echoed in Mike's mind. "You'll never be rid of me." The truth in that statement gnawed at him, knowing the depth of Julian's reach. Inside the house, Emily sat with Tommy, comforting him as best as she could. The boy was safe, but the trauma of the night was evident in his wide, fearful eyes. Richard stood by the window, staring out into the night, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. Mike joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through this," Mike said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But we need to be prepared for what's next." Richard nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "I know, but how do we protect everyone we love from a man like Julian?" The question hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the dangers that still lurked. As dawn broke, bathing the room in a soft, golden light, a sense of resolve began to form. They would fight no matter the cost. Over the next few days, plans were set into motion. Michael Forsyth's team worked tirelessly to dismantle Julian's network, tracing his associates and cutting off his resources. Emily took on the task of fortifying their home, ensuring that Tommy and the rest of the family were safe. But the cost of their victory weighed heavily on everyone. Mike found himself wrestling with the guilt of the sacrifices made, questioning every decision. One evening, as he sat alone in his study, the enormity of the situation overwhelmed him. Just as despair threatened to take hold, Emily entered the room, her presence a balm to his troubled mind. She sat beside him, her hand finding his. "We're going to get through this," she said softly. "Together." Her words, simple yet powerful, reignited the fire within him. They had come this far together, and they would see it through to the end. With renewed determination, Mike threw himself into the task at hand, coordinating efforts with Michael and strategizing their next moves. As days turned into weeks, the pressure continued to mount. Julian's reach seemed endless, and every victory was met with new challenges. It was during one of these intense strategy sessions that they received a tip. Julian was planning something big, something that could tip the scales in his favor. Realizing the urgency, Mike and his team worked around the clock to decipher Julian's plan. They knew that any misstep could have catastrophic consequences. The tension was palpable, each second ticking by with agonizing slowness. Then it happened. A breakthrough. They uncovered a plot to sabotage the city's power grid, a move that would plunge the entire area into chaos and give Julian the cover he needed to strike. With no time to lose, Mike mobilized his team, coordinating with local authorities to thwart the attack. The night of the operation was a blur of activity and adrenaline. Mike found himself in the heart of the action, leading the charge to protect the city. The streets were a battleground, but their resolve was unshakable. In the midst of the chaos, Mike faced Julian once more. The confrontation was fierce, each man fighting with everything they had. Julian's eyes burned with a manic intensity, his desperation making him even more dangerous. But this time, Mike was ready. Drawing on every ounce of strength and determination, he managed to overpower Julian, bringing him to the ground. As the authorities moved in to secure Julian, a wave of relief washed over Mike. They had done it. They had stopped Julian's plan and saved countless lives. As the dust settled and the city began to recover, Mike stood with his team, battered but victorious. The sacrifices they had made were immense, but the triumph was sweeter for it. Back at Richard's home, there was a sense of calm that hadn't been felt in weeks. Tommy ran to his father, a look of pure joy on his face. Richard scooped him up, holding him close as tears of relief streamed down his face. Emily joined them, her eyes meeting Mike's with a look of profound gratitude. They had faced insurmountable odds and emerged stronger. The bonds forged in the fires of their struggle were unbreakable. And as they stood together, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it as a united front. In the quiet aftermath, Mike and Emily took a moment to themselves. The stars shone brightly above, a reminder of the hope that had guided them through the darkest times. Emily leaned into Mike, her voice a whisper in the night. "We made it." Mike smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "Yes, we did. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As the night drew to a close, they knew that the journey was far from over. But for now, they had triumphed over the darkness, and the future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. The sun rose over the city, casting a golden light that felt like a promise of renewal. Mike stood on the balcony of his modest apartment, watching the dawn with a sense of cautious optimism. The events of the past weeks had been harrowing, but the storm had finally passed. Julian Hart was behind bars, and the city was safe once more. Inside, the apartment buzzed with the sounds of a new day. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with a lightness in her step that Mike hadn't seen in months. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, creating a comforting backdrop to the morning. Tommy sat at the table, his eyes bright with excitement as he recounted his latest adventure in a superhero comic. "Mike, can you get the orange juice from the fridge?" Emily called, her voice cheerful. "Sure thing," Mike replied, walking into the kitchen and feeling a warmth in his heart at the sight of his family. They had been through so much, but they had emerged stronger, united by the trials they had faced. As they sat down to breakfast, the conversation turned to the future. Richard joined them, his face showing signs of the relief and hope that had slowly been replacing the worry lines etched by recent events. "What's the plan for today?" Richard asked, his tone casual but tinged with the anticipation of new beginnings. "Well, I was thinking of taking Tommy to the park," Emily said, ruffling Tommy's hair playfully. "He deserves a day of fun after everything that's happened." Tommy's face lit up with a grin. "Can we play soccer, Dad? And maybe get ice cream?" "Of course, buddy," Mike said, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. "It's a new beginning for all of us." As the day unfolded, they spent time in the park, the sun shining down on them as they played and laughed together. The shadows of the past seemed to fade with each passing moment, replaced by the brightness of hope and the promise of a better future. Later in the afternoon, they gathered at Richard's house for a small celebration. Friends and family joined them, sharing in the joy of their newfound peace. There was a sense of community and support that filled the air, a reminder that they were not alone in their journey. Michael Forsyth made an appearance, his demeanor as composed as ever but with a rare smile that hinted at his satisfaction with the outcome of their battle. He approached Mike, extending a hand. "You did well, Mike," Michael said, his tone sincere. "You kept your family safe and stood up against a formidable enemy. That's no small feat." Mike shook his hand, gratitude evident in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you and the team. Thank you for everything." Michael nodded, then turned to address the gathered group. "To new beginnings," he said, raising a glass. "May we always find the strength to overcome any challenge and the courage to protect those we love." As the evening wore on, the atmosphere grew more relaxed. Stories were shared, laughter echoed through the rooms, and a sense of healing permeated the space. Emily and Mike found a quiet moment together, sitting on the porch and watching the stars. "It's hard to believe we came through it all," Emily said softly, her hand entwined with Mike's. "It is," Mike agreed, his gaze fixed on the sky. "But we did, and now we have a chance to start anew." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "What do you think the future holds?" Mike smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "Whatever it brings, we'll face it together. We've proven we can handle anything." As the night deepened, they returned inside to join their family and friends. The warmth of their connections, the bonds forged in adversity, made the future seem not just possible but bright with promise. Tommy ran up to them, his face flushed with excitement. "Dad, can we watch a movie tonight? A superhero one?" Mike chuckled, lifting his son into his arms. "Absolutely, buddy. Let's make it a night to remember." And so they did. Surrounded by loved ones, with the promise of a new beginning ahead, they watched the movie, laughter and joy filling the room. The past was behind them, the future was theirs to shape, and together, they were ready for whatever lay ahead. Click on the video being recommended to you now.